welcome back to the ATMA Paradigm, and we're now starting part 2 of our webinar series. So we've just completed part 1 on consciousness, and this next part 2, which covers the world and gives you an alternative view of it, will cover all the aspects of this next stage of matter and reality. But I need to start today with a certain recap, because we have hopefully new folk with us for this part, and some of them coming in now that we're broadcasting directly to YouTube on the ATMA Paradigm channel. So welcome to any newcomers. Today I'm just going to do a summary of the first 8 parts, 8 talks that we did. And the reason for doing that is, I know some of you have valiantly laboured through all of them, but I hope this summary, at least for you, contains both useful reminders and also some new thoughts and new ways of thinking about the same material. But for those who are joining us for the first time, I think this is maybe your first exposure to the ideas behind the ATMA paradigm. So I'm going to give the recap, but there are a lot of the aspects which of course were covered in detail in the previous talks. And there's even a little reference circle to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen on many of the slides, which indicate which talk it was you can reference. But it's not difficult, because the clue is in the titles of the various talks. So I intend to not labour or repeat material that is very important, but which we'll be getting much more analysis in the talks to come. Because really what we have done is just establish a foundation for the real exploration of the metaphysics of the ATMA paradigm. So let us proceed with our recap. We start explaining that the ATMA paradigm is really looking at the big questions of existence: consciousness, matter, life, and the universe. And in our earlier talk, and you'll see 1.1 on the side of the slide, we covered the idea of how the scientific method has been very brilliant at analysing, studying, and shedding light on various aspects of each of these questions of existence and origins. Now, there is a limitation to the scientific method by its own definition. And really what has happened is that the methodology is sacrificing scope for clarity within its boundaries. So the scientific method is highly effective for getting evidence within its specific boundaries, but what happens outside of those boundaries? It needs another type of methodology, one which is based on philosophy and logic, in order to really look at those areas which lie outside what the scientific method can honestly deal with. Now, what we looked at, how currently it seems that the scientific evidence is being analysed under the kind of ideology of what we call physicalism. The concept that the only thing that exists is physical stuff, and that we have to explain all phenomena, everything we know of, within that kind of limitation. So the only thing that exists in matter, and therefore everything has to have a material, mechanistic explanation. Now, as we kind of demonstrated, and we'll kind of recap a little bit on this, that is not a sufficiently broad enough paradigm in which to include everything we know about existence. It will not cover consciousness, and that was what we showed. I will later show that it doesn't even cover matter, and certainly not life, and it cannot tell us what is the origin and what is beyond the universe. So we need a bigger box to put these big topics in. And we're suggesting that we need a framework, a philosophical framework that can encapsulate them all. And we are offering the ATMA paradigm. We are building it from scientific evidence. It is consistent with the scientific evidence, but it is evidence which has been elucidated by the insights of Vedic wisdom. And this is from the ancient tradition of Vedanta, Sankhya, Yoga, the philosophical schools of ancient India. And therefore it is part of, of course, a bigger ontological picture of reality. And we also say that we are not here to prove theological principles. However, you can look at the ATMA paradigm and you would see that it may be supportive of the theological proposition. Now, the standard narrative using these four big issues is to say, well, the first thing that happens is that matter appears, whether it's Big Bang or that, whatever is the start of this universe, matter appears and it coalesces into the structure we know from galaxies and stars and everything else, and that forms the universe. And then in one, at least, or maybe more, places within the universe, the conditions are ripe for life to take hold. Somehow or other, again, matter coalescing into biological systems, which somehow or other reproduce and continue to proliferate. And when life gets to a certain stage of complexity, they say, consciousness appears. That is the standard narrative. And we would suggest that kind of takes things in the wrong order. That the real thing that you have to kind of work from is who we are and what we're doing here and how the fact that I know I exist. So we will be exploring science, logic, philosophy from the point of view of that which we know for certain. And that's why we will start with consciousness. And by understanding consciousness, we will then be able to recognize how we interact with the world around us, how we understand the world, and have a better idea of the actual reality we find ourselves within. And by understanding consciousness and matter, we are then better equipped to understand the combination of consciousness, matter in the form of biological organisms, our bodies, which manifest this wonderful thing we call life. And by understanding life, we will then be able to understand the nature and the why and wherefores of the universe. So we want to start our philosophical search from the phenomenon of our own awareness, consciousness. And we know consciousness is a big issue. So what are all the things that people think about when they hear this word consciousness and start to analyze it? And here is just a batch of them. And the big problem frankly, with a lot of the modern analysis of consciousness is conflation. It takes all these different points and thinks that they're all kind of equivalent, they're all representative of consciousness. And they are to some degrees, but certain aspects of them are secondary, maybe even tertiary, and some of them are primary. And what we have to get to when we're looking at consciousness is what is the absolute kind of hallmark of this wonderful thing we call consciousness. So we are now going to take a step back from these and identify what we can commonly agree is certain. Because by getting the point of commonality and agreement, we can then build a kind of framework with certain amount of consensus. So we start with the big question, do you exist? And if you are able to say yes to that, the question then becomes, how do you know you exist? Well, you exist as a conscious entity because you'll say, I see, I feel, I experience stuff. And this, of course, goes back to the sort of analysis that René Descartes did, but I'm quoting a previous analysis by Jiva Goswami from the 15th, 16th century. And he gave that as one of his propositions, that I exist as a conscious entity because I experience things. Then he said, and I know that I am the witness of the content of my mind. That doesn't mean that everything in our mind is correct. We get lots of mistaken things, but I know that I am the witness of the content of my mind and the actions of my body. And furthermore, I am the same unchanging witness throughout my life. And Jiva Goswami offered a fourth one. He said, I also know that I aspire for agreeable experiences. So this gives us 4 certainties on consciousness. I am a conscious being. I am the observer, the witness. I am the subject, the I of my experiences. And I am the same observer, the same I, the same entity throughout my life. And that I aspire for agreeable experiences. I want to be happy. I want things to go my way. I want to enjoy. So these are 4 things we know for certain. Now, if anyone wants to argue that maybe we've got these wrong, maybe these are not certainties, then you have to ask yourself, what would you replace them with? What can you replace these certainties with that offers greater certainty? You can certainly speculate on other things you might want to believe in, but actually you've got much less reason to believe in anything else in this world than these points. So it would seem that we should build our exploration of existence on these certainties. And these came from the 16th century, but the same ideas have been encapsulated in a statement by philosopher John Searle. He said, the essential trait of consciousness that we need to explain is unified, qualitative subjectivity. Now, this isn't a definition of consciousness, but it's a very good summary of the key principles that must be included in any explanation that is given for consciousness. And any explanation which doesn't deal with these points cannot be considered to be satisfactory. It is partial, it is incomplete, it may be dealing with some expression, some kind of psychological aspect, but it is not dealing with the fundamental issue of the nature of consciousness. Now, it's a mouthful. Unified qualitative subjectivity. Let's go through it. Unified. This means that I experience myself as a singular person. I am the one person experiencing my existence. So I'm soul, I'm individual, I'm unchanging, I'm complete. And I am the I, the subject having the experiences. This is the subjectivity aspect of it. And there's a third element, qualitative. This is a harder one to kind of get our heads around, but it's actually one of the most crucial. Qualitative means that my mental experiences have qualities. Now, don't worry, I'll come back and we'll unpack that carefully for you. But each of them are crucial. And you probably feel a little bit more comfortable with the first 2. Yeah, I can kind of get that. I kind of know I exist. I'm a person, you know, I'm an entity. And I've been the same person experiencing my life when I was a kid. I was there. Yes, my mind, my kind of personality, body has changed. But I'm still that same person. Excuse me. However, this third one is a little trickier, but it's worth dedicating time to. Because while the other principles arise from intuition and personal analysis, they're subjective. The qualitative aspect of consciousness can be explored empirically by neuroscience and kind of psychological experiments. And therefore, it represents the Achilles heel of the whole physicalist idea that the brain is the source of consciousness. And I'm going to refer to that concept as the brain model, as just as a form of shorthand. There's so many different kind of ideas, theories, and kind of aspects to it. But overall, this is a certain concept that all aspects of consciousness can be explained completely by reference to the neurological functions of the brain. That is its postulation. That is its claim. That's what it must stand for. Now, the issue is that it has to, if it's going to be a full explanation, it's got to include all aspects of consciousness, not just the ones you like or the ones you choose to explain. And specifically, your explanation of where consciousness comes from better include you. Me as the entity, you as the person experiencing your life. There has to be an explanation why there is that subjectivity in your experience. And further, what you actually experience in terms of what is your experience of. In this case, we show the proverbial red ball. So the inability of the brain model to account for consciousness in terms of subjective, qualitative existence and experience means that consciousness is the hard problem of science. So I'll repeat that. The inability of the brain model to account for consciousness in terms of subjective existence and qualitative experience makes consciousness the hard problem of science. And as many people have noted in the literatures, it is the hard problem. Science has got lots of hard problems, but only one of them gets to call itself the hard problem. And because of this particular problem, the whole edifice of physicalism is in danger of collapse. Let me take you through this qualitative part of the problem. And I refer you to this image, which appeared in a paper produced by Francis Crick of DNA fame when he was working with Christoph Koch on neural coordinates of consciousness. They produced this drawing, and it's kind of typical. No one has ever disputed it. This is the issue of kind of perception. And let's find our way through it. First, looking at this. Okay, we got a scene from the outside world, the little man and his walking his dog. And, you know, someone is looking at that. Light is coming in from the world around and entering the eyes. Okay, we know how the senses work. We know how the eye works. We know how it converts light into biochemical electrical activity. We know where it sends it to in the Brodmann's area 17 at the back of the brain. So now we're inside the brain. Great. This is what we got. We've got neurons firing off one another, setting up electrical patterns. That's great. That's what we got. In fact, that's all we got. Now the big bit, so that's called the easy bits. Now it's not, you know, some very intelligent people have worked with some very sophisticated equipment in order to analyze this in detail, but it is the easy bit because it's this next bit that is the problem. How is it that our brain just got this electrical activity, but what we experience of the whole event is a picture in our minds? Now, we're so bewildered that we honestly believe that the picture we're experiencing is outside of us. But actually, it's inside, it's internal, it's in our mind. I'm not saying that there isn't a world out there, you know, we're not saying that. But we're saying that our experience of it is after all this stuff happens in the brain. So all the stuff on the left, the green bit, is now irrelevant. That's why it's kind of shaded out. All we got to deal with now is the buzzing around of electricity in our brain. And somehow or other, how does that give rise to an image that I experience? And who's it for? Who is this person who believes that they have experienced it? So this brings in the qualitative aspect and the concept that I need you to understand, a principle called QUALIA. So, what is it like to experience the redness of red? So, when we see this ball, we are absorbed in its redness. Now, the experience of redness doesn't mean how you feel about it, whether you think it's a warm color and whether it makes you feel cozy. No, redness as red, the pure color quality of redness. That's what you're experiencing here now. And it's different from your experience of the blueness of this. So these qualities of this experience, I have a picture of a ball in my mind, and I can either, and sometimes the qualities of that picture are redness and sometimes it's blueness. So this is qualia. Qualia is a term derived from the Latin. It's in the plural. It's a plural form of the word. There is a singular, which is quale, much less used in the literature. And it relates to the English word qualities. So qualia are the qualities of all our inner experiences. And there's several features that we dedicated a whole talk to qualia. And I'm giving a little bit of time within this recap also just to focus on it because it is so crucial for the development of our understanding. Qualia are real. They're the only things we experience. It's what we experience of the outside world. We have no direct contact, really, in terms of our awareness of the outside world. Yes, our hands may touch things, our eyes may pick up light, our ears may pick up vibrations, but ultimately all that has to be turned into the qualities of the stuff of our mind in order for us to experience what's going on. So the ones on the left, these are all our sensory experiences, and then at the top in the middle, they're the internal sensations, fear, hunger, happiness, and so on. They also have a qualitative experience of them. It's something that is like to feel happy or to feel fearful. And at the bottom, there's others: thoughts, ideas, memories. These are another type. They have their own qualia qualities to them. So qualia are real. They cannot be denied. We experience them. It's impossible, just as it's impossible to say I do not exist, it is impossible to say I do not experience qualia. Next, they are subjective. And this probably is the problem for science, because it doesn't like dealing with things that are subjective. We know that, or we assume that we each experience similar things. We may look at the red ball and we know that we're each looking at a red ball. But how we experience that red ball internally may differ. And we've shown the picture of that dress, which different people do see it in different colors. So qualia could be differently experienced by different people. They're private. They're ineffable. It's impossible to explain your experience to someone else. You can try and say, pointing, there's a ball, I see that as red. But you do not know what the other person sees that ball as. So they're ineffable, they're indescribable, but still real. And the crucial thing is that qualia, these qualities of our inner experience, are not identical to the stimulus. They're not identical to the aspect of the outside world which interacted with our senses, which gave rise to the neural activity, which somehow or other is now being interpreted by our minds and feeding us this imagery or these tastes or these sensations or flavors or whatever. So qualia are internal, they're not external properties. And we gave a good analysis of how to understand light and the fact that color is an internal property, not an external property. Go to 1.3 if you want more on that. And ultimately, the big point is that it is impossible to reduce qualia, the qualities of our experience, back down to physical properties and what our brain is able to achieve. So qualia defy all attempts to reduce them to physics or brain processes. Hence, qualia are the unanswered phenomena of consciousness. Now, I just give this little quote from Michael Tye, professor at Stanford. For many on both sides of the argument, qualia are seen to represent the de facto proof that conscious perception must be non-neural. Now, that's a heavy statement. He and others may not agree with it, but the reality of qualia is so powerful that it absolutely challenges the physicalist notion. Hence, there are so many attempts to try and deny and get rid of qualia. And we spent lecture 1.5 on looking at all the theories. There isn't just one theory of consciousness, there are loads. I'm not going to go through them now. We did try and cover them as best we could within one whole talk. But just to show you the kind of range that we went through, there were the cognitive and neural-based ideas of consciousness, higher order and reflexive ideas, higher order thought, perception, higher order understanding, higher order global state, so, and reflexive to do with self-awareness. Then we looked at the eliminativist, the ones that try to deny the nature of consciousness, normally by saying either our qualia experience is identical to brain states, which no one seems to kind of think, well, that doesn't seem to express anything, or to say, well, it's representational, that doesn't seem to work. Functionalist, no. Or the most famous type of eliminative theory is Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model. So there is a little bit of an analysis in 1.5 on that. And we also looked at quantum-based ideas using coherence, entanglement, and Penrose and Hameroff's orchestrated objective reduction. No, good with that. And as a little bit of a sidebar, we looked at the idea, well, is there anything in synthetic consciousness? So we explored synthetic consciousness through artificial general or even super intelligence, which is a possibility. But it doesn't equate to actual sentience. And although there are still some people in the field who are confident that we'll create sentient machines or algorithms or AI in some way or other, that confidence is slowly sapping away. It's certainly reckoned that we may reach general or super intelligence, but not necessarily sentience. That what we may be able to get computing to do in terms of thought processing or what, information processing, language and behavior would really amount to simulation rather than actual conscious behavior and experience. And then we gave a little time to integrated information theory because it brings in the role of information and is one of the prominent consciousness ideas at the present time. It has its limitations, it's not accepted by everyone, but it's of interest. But it also opened the door for new non-reductive theories and also reworking of old ideas like panpsychism. Panpsychism is the idea that consciousness cannot be reduced to other physical properties, so ones we know about, but so maybe consciousness should be regarded as a fundamental property in itself. And that's an interesting thought. That's starting to show the problems that people are having with all the other ideas. They're willing to start looking a little bit more broadly. Now, instead of going through all these theories in detail now, it's actually more useful to understand that there are 4 basic approaches used by each of the researchers and brains behind these theories. And each person uses maybe one or maybe several of these approaches. And these approaches are like this: diminish. That if you can, instead of talking about consciousness in terms of subjective activity, instead of talking about qualia, you can say, well, really consciousness is just information, it's just mental content, it's just data processing. You're trying to diminish what you're dealing with down to something more manageable. Or you conjure, and this is basically just a bit of rabbit out of the hat. You say consciousness must be an emergent property, it's an epiphenomenon, just somehow or other it appears. We don't know how, don't ask us to explain, we don't know the causal thing, but that's our belief. It's a rabbit out of a hat. Or deny, well, we can't find anything in the brain that can justify consciousness or can explain it. So maybe we should just say consciousness doesn't exist, or it's a false or virtual illusion. It's an echo of something that the brain's doing, but it doesn't effectively exist. And if you can't use any of those, you can always promise someday we will have a theory of the physical source of consciousness. Don't ask us what it'll be based on, but we hope it will be founded. So these ideas have changed over the years, which is rather interesting. I think when I was a young student and the prevailing idea was that brain structure and its functions would explain consciousness. But it was really dealing with the easy problems because consciousness, the idea of consciousness was really based on behaviorism and functionalism. And because of the new equipment we had, EEGs, CAT scans, fMRI, we could do, very pretty pictures of different things flashing in the brains. And it was very seductive to think that this would explain consciousness. But that kind of has fallen by the wayside because really all we started to find is the same old stuff in the brain. And we're not seeing anything that would really give rise to the experience of qualia. So we say consciousness, the next thing that came up was conjuring, an emergent property, an epiphenomenon, as we said. But that's fallen a little, it's still used. In fact, I heard a BBC little clip this morning saying exactly the same thing, consciousness is an epiphenomenon. They also said they tried to diminish it, and they also tried to promise, but they still use this phrase, epiphenomenon. But that's becoming less attractive to those in the know, because it doesn't explain anything and it just sounds like you're just kind of guessing. So for a while, the deniers like Dennett and others were actually getting some prominence, the idea that consciousness is an illusion. However, a lot of others have reacted against that and called it even the silliest idea in the world. So the current kind of, I would say, a la mode theory of consciousness is to promise that, yeah, okay, we don't really understand the brain. We don't even understand matter very well. Our physics is still undeveloped. And yes, we'll need to kind of get much further down the road in our physics and biology and neuroscience before we can really say what consciousness is and how it is produced. So a very, very big promise. Presently, there is no satisfactory theory that can link subjective, qualitative consciousness to the brain. There is nothing, no theory that can link the two. So never mind making it as an absolute claim. You haven't even got a theory that can base it on it. There is no direct evidence. This is the total amount of direct evidence that the brain produces consciousness that has been found. Nothing. But there are many challenges to the brain model, and we presented these in 1.7, looking at the issues of hydrocephalus and the AWARE project, which demonstrated how consciousness could persist even when it was noted that the brain was functionally dead, absolutely flatlined. Evidence of veridical experiences from OBEs and NDEs also help to establish that somehow or other a person can remain conscious and undergo real experiences at times when the brain has totally shut down. This is a major obstacle to the brain model. So just to summarize the issues here, and what we want to kind of suggest is that the brain model as a theory, as an idea, doesn't score very well in terms of what we need from consciousness. It doesn't give us any understanding of the coherence and the continuity of the self. Why I feel I exist as the same person throughout my life. It doesn't give us any explanation of the subjective experience of qualia. And within one of our other talks, we analysed that even simple perception is not explainable by what the brain can do. The brain has incredible limitations, and we will be going through some of those and analysing them and explaining what is actually happening from a different perspective in the talks to come. As I've just gone through, there's no theory. There's no direct evidence. In the talk last week, we looked a little bit at the psychology and showed how issues of free will, culpability, just find no place in the brain model. There's no way of substantiating those as principles in the way that we believe them. Similarly, there's no way of establishing our attraction, if you like, or our conviction about higher values and purpose. Now, it should be noted that I'm not saying that just because it can't explain free will or higher values that it means it's wrong. No, we're not saying that. It's not a proof against it. It's just that it's just another factor where the brain model is not really dealing with something that we do give some credit to. And the key issue are all the previous ones. Coherence and continuity of self, of the identity of the individual, the subjective experience of qualia and perception, and so on. These are the things that kill the brain model. Whereas what we will demonstrate is that the ATMA paradigm gets a lot of ticks on these. So that just makes it a more attractive theory to follow. And really that's the point we're trying to get to. That if you've got one model and all the efforts, all the money that has been spent on trying to substantiate the brain model is not getting us anywhere. It's time, as David Chalmers said, we need a new approach, we need a new ingredient to cross the explanatory gap. And that's when we are presenting the idea of the ATMA paradigm. Now, we just gave a slight introduction to it, which I'm now just going to go through in this last section of the of this particular talk. I'm going to knock myself off for a second so that the slides will can fill the screen here. Okay, so where does this lead? We're going back to this analysis that, and you may notice I've turned Crick and Cox drawing around. That's for my own purposes. I like to do it from this side. But you've got the outside world now on your right. Light is going in. We've got the little man in his eye, so that's the sensory functions. Information is now going to the brain. That's great. This is the bit that we're all agreeing on. No one's got a problem on it. The next question is what happens next. So the idea that somehow or other you've got this data in the brain, but there is a picture that is experienced by someone. So there are these mental functions. Now, the physicalist idea is trying to kind of fit the mental functions into the neural functions and to say somehow or other they are related. But that is actually where the problem breaks down, as we've said. You cannot fit the mental functions into the neural functions. So you've got a choice. You can either ignore all the evidence against you, all the problems, and keep beating the same old effort to try and resolve qualia to brain activity, or you do something different. And we all know that kind of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Time for something different. So what we are suggesting is, why not just isolate those mental functions and say, these are something qualitatively different from the functions that are happening within the brain, the body, and the senses. The brain, body, and senses operate by its biochemistry, fine. And they produce electricity, they produce, but mental functions need to be considered to be independent. They are related, but they are fundamental. Now, this might seem to be similar to kind of dualist ideas of mind and matter, but let's not get hung up on that for now. We'll kind of unpack issues of dualism, idealism, and all that sort of stuff in forthcoming talks. And we'll look at the interactionism, substance. We'll deal with all of that in due course. For now, the important thing is not to be distracted and simply understand we have functions which we know are real. We need to find a home for them. We need to have a way of dealing with them. So let's, for now, look at these mental functions as being fundamental, elementary. Now, there's no reason to suppose that mental functions themselves are conscious, because they seem to be something we are conscious of. So in our analysis of mental processing and content, we don't find a subjective observer within qualia. Qualia are something that are experienced by consciousness, but qualia are not consciousness themselves. So we must ask ourselves, who or what is doing the experience of the qualia of the products of these mental functions? Who is the observer? So the ability or property to consciously experience mental content is itself a fundamental function and property. It doesn't reduce to the mind, and it doesn't reduce to the brain, and the mind doesn't reduce to the brain. And please note that I'm using this word mind. You see it's in inverted commas because we're using it as a kind of generalized term, which is at least understood by those by philosophers as the psychological stuff of our mental kind of thing, if you could say. So whatever is responsible for consciousness functions, we would have to realize that it's irreducible, it's elemental. So we need to create a further category of consciousness functions separate from mental functions, separate from neural and sensory functions. Now, is this getting too complicated, a model of perception or experience? Well, no. In fact, it's staring us in the face at every moment, and certainly at this moment, because you're all looking at a screen behind which is a processor, which is picking up data from elsewhere in the outside world. Often it will be picking up information from a camera or something, but today your screen is picking up information which is coming to you via the internet. It is going into the processor. It is digital data. So that's equivalent to the green box of the outside world relating to the neural functions here. But a computer has a screen. It doesn't have a screen for its own purposes. It uses that screen in order to communicate with something beyond itself. So that is its interface. And besides the interface of the screen, there is an actual person, an operator, an observer, a witness, sitting, enjoying whatever comes on the screen. So using that analogy, we can suggest that consciousness is a fundamental property, and therefore it has its own field of reality. And like other fields, it has its own fundamental particle. So we're suggesting that there is the existence of an entity which is imbued with the characteristics of conscious existence and experience. And you'll see under the smiley face there, we have used the word Atma to denote this entity. And of course that links with our title. And we are going to offer this as the entity which itself is imbued with these consciousness functions. We use the word Atma, and it's a Sanskrit term, and we chose it for its precision. We can define it in this way: the smallest unit composed of and possessing a quantum of the property of consciousness. And it gives us an understanding. These are further kind of explanations of this term and what it means. It means an individual personal entity having subjective experience. So this is the entity with the subjectivity, with the coherence of unity. This is the seer, the witness, the observer, the experiencer of qualia. And it is the conscious self, and we spent a little time on this one in the last talk, separating our understanding of the conscious self from other forms of selfhood. So the conscious self is beyond identification with other forms which we can say are extraneous or psychological and social selfhood. We all have many kind of selves that we believe ourselves to be and which we adopt in order to interact with everyone and to think of ourselves even. But beyond all of them, there is that conscious self which is the entity, the seer, the witness, the observer of all of those other forms of selfhood. So we spent a little time on 1.7 or 1.8 on that particular one. And we can say that the Atma, another way of thinking of it, is a non-physical, it's a non-neural coordinating particle. And we will come to explore that more in the talks to come. There was a question, well, what about consciousness in other species? And in the last talk, we did look at this one. And the answer is yes. There is now good evidence that different animals experience consciousness. And we showed all the way down to crustaceans how you can kind of, as near as damn it, let's say, you can empirically show that animals are experiencing qualitatively. And if they are experiencing qualitatively, that means that they are sentient and actually conscious. They may not be conscious that they're conscious, but they are conscious of qualia. And if they're conscious of qualia, then it means that consciousness, in our terms, exists, and therefore that consciousness is also arising from the presence of themselves as the Atma. So within every life form, we are suggesting that the Atma is present. Now it experiences consciousness and awareness to different or greater and lesser degrees, and that is a subject we'll explore in part 3 when we get to look at life and analyze both the similarities and the distinctiveness of conscious experience. I'm back, by the way. Distinctive conscious experience in animals, plants, and all life forms. Now, just to note that really what we are presenting so far is a very simplified model. This is simply just to kind of get our heads around this separation of elementary functions. But I consider this to be very simplistic, and we are going to spend part 2 really unpacking all of this. But in our previous talks, we did at least demonstrate the efficacy of this model in general terms. We put it through a number of tests. We gave it some challenges. We compared it with the ideas used to justify the brain model. We demonstrated some applications in terms of psychology and how we understand ourselves. And what emerges is the model stands up. And I've discussed this with many psychologists and with them and said that your problem of conflation, thinking that the brain is the all in all and that mind, consciousness, self, everything exists within the brain, that's problematic to your analysis, to your treatment, to your therapies, to your diagnosis. If you pull apart the different functions, you have a better model for understanding the interaction of consciousness and selfhood, mental functions and neural functions. And we will, again, provide some further detail on how we can help psychologists and psychiatrists within the work that they're doing. So the key message of the whole of part 1 was dedicated to consciousness. And it was really intended that we abandon any idea, any notion, any attachment to the idea that the brain could produce consciousness. Really, it has just been foundational in order to get to this point. Consciousness is a primary, elementary, fundamental facet of reality, and that is the only way it can really be approached. Now, someone might say, well, you may be wrong, and I'd rather go and keep plumbing away at the brain model and see where we get to. You can, of course you can. That's up to the individuals. But at least some of us should be exploring this. And when we start to get into it, I think you'll become very excited how it's starting to really produce something very interesting and starts to deal with some of the other big questions that science has. So really, this is the beginning of the ATMA paradigm. We're now poised to start our explanation of the incredible attributes of consciousness. This idea that consciousness is primary opens up a whole new perspective on our existence. So here's a sense of what we've got to come. In the talks in part 2, we'll look at the nature of consciousness. We'll unpack that simple model. We'll give you the detail of how consciousness interacts with the world. We'll look at all the big questions and challenges that may be there. And we're not just dealing with the challenges, we're actually showing you new ways and new perspectives of understanding the nature of reality. We'll see what's out there. How does matter work? And we'll explore not just the aspect of experience and perception that we have focused on up to now. We'll look at the issue of volition and how the Atma is one participant in a kind of co-creation of reality. And we'll explain all this by bringing in the Sankhya metaphysics. Now, as we said, we're not here to prove the Sankhya metaphysics. We're here to see what insights exist that may help to elucidate reputable scientific evidence. So we will use the insights of Sankhya in order to shed light on what modern physics is now observing for itself. And we will come across some interesting technologies for manipulating matter. Technologies that we will then help to understand and how they influence biology. So by knowing consciousness and matter, we will then be able to study life, and knowing what life is and what it wants, we can then fathom this big thing that we're involved with, the universe. Now, it's time for our questions and answers session. It sometimes takes a little bit for things to come through. So if there's any questions, you can use the chat on Facebook, or I hope the YouTube one is also operational. And one question has been has been offered. Is the ATMA paradigm trying to prove the existence of the soul by means of pratyaksha? We are building this on, first of all, from concepts of philosophy. So we're building up the rationale for why we would believe and accept that consciousness is non-neural, consciousness is its own independent facet of reality. And yes, that does offer subjective exploration. And yes, we will kind of make some reference to the sages and yogis of the past and present who have used this model to try and explore the nature of their own consciousness through very deep practices of yoga and meditation, the sort of practices that are not available at your local leisure center. And that is one way of giving subjective personal experience of the nature of one's consciousness and seeing it separate from its interaction with the rest of physicality. We will explore that to some degree and show how that can help. The question has been asked, we could also be challenged that the Atma does not explain qualia. Now, we have to offer an understanding of the nature of qualia, and that is exactly what we're going to do in these forthcoming talks. What we have simply done so far, and I've just said that really it's just foundational. We have explained that qualia cannot be reduced to the brain and to physical properties. They have to be part of mental functions, which are their own type of reality, and that the observer of that type of mental reality is again distinct. So we are just building a model bit by bit. So we will be able to explain all the points about how qualia are experienced in the forthcoming talks. So let me just read one more. We may not be able to explain the changes in the brain give rise to color changes in our visual field. There's a certain technicality that you have brought in on this question of how changes in the brain give rise to changes of experience. And we will show how they're related, and we will show why they're related, but why they are different and why they're experienced differently. So stick with us. It'll probably be in 2 or 3 talk time on that one. And then someone's asking, is our definition of the Atma derived from religious texts and should be accepted on faith? I've never mentioned faith. I've never mentioned religious texts. I've never mentioned soul. I'm simply talking philosophy of the nature of consciousness, and I'm just establishing that if you have a choice, you can believe that the brain is responsible for your existence, but there actually is no evidence, no theory, no justification for that whatsoever. So follow that if you want blind faith. If you want to base your exploration of your own existence, then do it on the basis of good evidence and good philosophy. And yes, we are using the insights of the Vedic literature, but it would be demeaning just to say that, because they come from the Vedic literature, they're linked to a religion and therefore it's to do with belief. No. This doesn't require blind faith. Every time we make an assumption or an initiative to do something, we actually have a certain bit of faith. I don't step outside of my house unless I have faith that I will be able to go somewhere, I'll be able to walk, I won't get hurt, I won't be eaten by some wild beast. I've got faith that it will be okay, and therefore that's my initiative. Any scientific project, any research is based that I have certain amount of faith, you can say, or really it's a certain inkling, suspicion, commitment, conviction that maybe this will bring success. And if you've got sound philosophical rationale for your exploration of consciousness, then you can proceed with confidence, not just on the basis of blind faith. There's another question about the void. Is that the same as consciousness or nothingness? Nope. We have not tried to equate consciousness with nothingness. Rather, at every stage in our presentation, and I beg Bishal, Jagat Palan and others to please go back and explore the previous talks, because you'll see we're really talking about consciousness as somethingness and our mental experience as another somethingness and the external world as another somethingness. Now, I think that concludes all our questions for today. So I just invite you to please be with us next week when we'll be analysing what's out there, a consciousness-based perspective on reality. So again at 6 o'clock, and this simultaneous broadcast to Facebook and YouTube will continue for the rest of the webinar series. So I hope you can join me next week. Thank you for all those who have joined today, and I look forward to being with you next week.